Well, good morning everyone. I'm Philip Esler from the University of Gloucestershire, and the last time I was in this wonderful building was to see Rob installed. An evening in which a particular highlight for me was the incredibly good women's unaccompanied choir that came here from a local church and, performed in a kind of transcendental way. It was wonderful. So I'm very, very glad to be back about a year later. I've given you a handout which is really just the outline of what I want to say, but it also gives you a few references and an appendix at the back that we'll get to in due course. So starting with some of the data on this topic, you all probably know Bob Dylan's song Highway 61, which starts in its first stanza like this. Well, God says to Abraham, kill me a son. Abe says, man, you must be putting me on. God say, no. Abe say, what? God said, you can do what you want, Abe, but the next time you see me coming, you better run. Well, Abe says, where you want this killing done? God says, out on Highway 61. So this is clearly one take on the account in Genesis 22 of God telling Abraham to kill his son Isaac. It is, if anything, even more chilling than Kierkegaard's philosophical and ethical reflection on that text in his celebrated work Fear and Trembling. Now clearly Dylan is playing with an idea very much rooted in US culture, the notion that Highway 61, which is actually a real highway running from New Orleans to Wyoming, is a kind of mythical place for refugees from the welfare system, criminals selling defective goods, promotions hosting the next world war for commercial gain, and for fathers willing to sacrifice their children to save their own sorry hides. And yet much of the punch in the first stanza comes largely from its being told through the lens of Genesis 22. Dylan is using the framework of meaning in the form of a particular narrative from the Bible, knowledge of which he presumes is shared by his audience, to undergird something deeply disturbing he wants to say about American life. Without the existence of a biblical story like this one to blend with contemporary experience, Dylan would not have had such a powerfully effective first stanza. Now, Dylan is doing this in a pop song, if I can use that expression in a context without offending any of you Dylan fans who might be here today. And of course, other songs on biblical themes have been written by Bob Marley, Adam and Eve, Black Man, Redemption, Exodus, etc., Leonard Cohen, Alleluia, Amy Grant, Breath of Heaven, and loads more. For nearly 2,000 years, authors, artists, and composers have been doing just the same thing. They've been drawing on the resources of biblical narratives from the Old and New Testaments and from the Apocrypha in the creation of literary texts, paintings, sculptures, and musical compositions. There can be no doubt that the Bible has been the most important single influence on Western literature, art, and music in the last 2,000 years. And as far as literature is concerned, the influence is seen not just in the more obvious classics like Dante's Divine Comedy, or Milton's Paradise Lost, or John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress. Many more recent works reflect its influence. Even in A Tale of Two Cities, Sidney Carton walks through a garden before he decides to sacrifice his own life, just as Jesus walks through Gethsemane. The influence of the Bible on Western culture has been very well set out by Canadian literary critic Northrop Frye in Anatomy of Criticism in 1957, and more programmatically in The Great Code, The Bible and Literature in 1981. And that latter book is a wonderful vade mecum, a wonderful kind of catechetical introduction almost on the subject. I am still unrepentant, however, for having gently chided the book at an event in Canberra in 1984 in Frye's presence for its diminution of the religious dimensions of the text. Still, Frye was pretty gracious to me afterwards. At the Oxford Literary Festival in March last year, well-known atheist author Philip Pullman said that the Bible should play a significant role in child education. He said that it was very important for children to be familiar with biblical stories as well as to have a knowledge of classical folk tales and Greek mythology. As far as art goes, the Bible has been influencing Christian art since the frescoes were painted in Roman catacombs from the 3rd century AD onwards. We then have a continuous tradition of church frescoes, of manuscript illuminations, panel paintings, canvases and sculptures on biblical narratives right up to the present. William Blake, as an artist, for example, produced works saturated with biblical imagery. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of extant pieces of work. And if you want to have a look at some of them in a searchable way, go to the Web Gallery of Art, a wonderful site maintained by the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, which now has 30,000 Western paintings, European paintings up to the 19th century, and you'll see that many of them are on biblical subjects. Classical music too is permeated with compositions on biblical themes. Examples include Haydn's The Creation, Handel's Oratorio, the Messiah, Vivaldi's Juditha Triumphans, Schoenberg's Moses and Aaron, and Verdi's Nabucco, just to name a few. There's loads, as you know. It would be tedious of me to spend any longer trying to prove the point that the Bible has had an immense influence on Western culture and to an extent remains to have that influence. So in the remainder of what I'm saying today, I'd like to consider why that has been the case, whether the Bible is likely to continue to have that influence, whether it matters if it doesn't, what are the main types of biblical readers and how they might benefit from it. And lastly, I want to raise the issue of what we can do about it if we think biblical literacy, which I'm going to understand mainly in terms of familiarity with the great biblical stories, is likely to decline. I guess that's something we should be thinking more about, though, later towards the end of this day, before we actually reach any views. So, moving on then to the question of why has the Bible been so influential culturally? If we search for the most general basis for the influence of the Bible, some recent work on the theory of metaphor provides a helpful starting point. Back in 1980, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson published what's become a very influential book called Metaphors We Live By. Metaphors We Live By. And they argued that metaphors are ways of structuring our cognitive system by allowing us to understand one domain in the terms of another. So, if you like, a metaphor entails the systematic mapping of patterns from one source, one domain, onto a target domain. And similar thinking was developed by Giles Fauconnier and Mark Turner in their 2002 book entitled The Way We Think, Conceptual Blending and the Mind's Hidden Complexity. So there's some sense about the way the human mind operates, which is very characteristic. It involves using one domain to understand another. Similarly, the use of the Bible allows us to map, admittedly in very contested ways, not just ideas, but also values, beliefs and identities from biblical texts onto contemporary experience. That's been going on for 2,000 years. That's what Dylan was doing in Highway 61. The fact that up to the Enlightenment, the whole authority of the Church stood behind much of this process and ensured all Christians everywhere were socialised to accept it, gave it a particular power and omnipresence. The Bible was widely, at some times and in some places universally believed to speak of the ongoing drama between God, humanity and creation, in which the most fundamental questions of life, death and immortal life were at stake. No wonder then that writers, artists and composers were deeply familiar with its narratives and created works based on them. Clearly they were also commissioned by patrons who had the same concerns. The Church and society at large were able to keep this going, at least until the Enlightenment, because the whole approach was embedded in what Peter Berger, in his book The Sacred Canopy, has termed a plausibility structure. A plausibility structure is a socio-cultural context for systems of meaning within which these meanings make sense or at least are made plausible. Beliefs and meanings held by individuals and groups are supported by and embedded in socio-cultural institutions and processes. Social arrangements may thus help a certain religious world appear self-evident, and the texts that it produces appear to be self-evidently authoritative. Where people attend church on Sunday or synagogue on Saturday and children's Sunday school, when the church is effectively pushing religious-based ethics into the community, when it is able to have its values enacted in civil law, when there is a strong religious element in homes and at schools, there is a strong plausibility structure supporting religious beliefs and values, and there the Bible will continue to have a role. So at this point, I'd like to tell you something from an experience of my own life to illustrate this point, and it links to memory that I want to say a little bit more about in a moment. It's 1957. I'm 5 years old, and I'm sitting in a Roman Catholic primary school in an outer semi-rural suburb of Sydney, run by the Daughter of Charity nuns. They were still in those pre-Vatican II days, wearing the black habit and the elaborate white starched bonnet that took them nearly 1 hour a day to clean and starch. I'm with about 40 other children, and we're sitting at our tiny tables and chairs, big classes. We cluster in a semicircle around one of the nuns who is telling us the story from Exodus 32 of Moses coming down from Mount Sinai with 2 tablets of the law, only to find the Israelites dancing around the golden calf. The nun is using a visual aid, a large coloured print of this scene, one of many such prints on a frame that she would turn over to reveal the next one as appropriate. I still vividly recollect the angry look on Moses' face as he was about to slam the tablets of the law into the ground. This is my earliest recollection of being exposed to an Old Testament narrative. And I sometimes wonder whether my interest in Old Testament narrative and in the visual depiction of Old Testament narratives goes back to Sister Agnes. Now, all of this, now we get to the plausibility structure. All of this was happening in an extremely strong Roman Catholic plausibility structure in my family and in the school, especially before Vatican II. Prayers several times a day, evening recitation of the Rosary every night, Mass on Sundays, feast days, missions on the first Friday of each month, all punctuated by some occasional dramatic event such as the ordination of the priesthood of a relative or a 2-week mission in the parish. Now, exposure to stories from the Bible was part and parcel of that life and that identity. At the same time, of course, there were Protestant children getting their Bible in Sunday school, some of them perhaps in plausibilities just as strong as mine, if differing in shape. Okay, I think that's unlikely, but I'm going to allow the possibility. Roman Catholic upbringing before Vatican II was an upbringing with real character. So what I've just given you is a strong memory I hold. Perhaps it is creeping senility, but the older I get, the more memory seems to matter in telling us who we are. In fact, actually, I'm not alone in this, and in the last decade or so, collective memory, in the form of collective memory theory of Maurice Halbwachs especially, who died during World War II, but his work has recently become very much in vogue, has become widely influential in the social sciences and in the humanities. And this theory looks at how groups preserve and create memory. So the group creates the memory which is then socialised into the members of the group, even if they weren't there when it happened. So, as an Australian, I have a strong memory of Anzac Day. Anzac Day happened on the 25th of April 1915. I wasn't there, but it's part of the national memory in Australia, and we will learn about it. So, it's about how groups create and preserve memories, the contents of what gets remembered, the situation in which memory is mobilised when you press the memory button, and the processes by which this happens. Even more helpfully, and this is on the sheet, we have the work of French sociologist Daniel Hervieux-Léger, Religion as a Chain of Memory, 2000. Now, in finding that work useful, which is a sociological work, I don't want to downplay what you might call primal religious experience. So This is the dimension of the numinous in religious experience as explained by Rudolf Otto early in the 20th century. This is the sense you have of God when the hair stands up on the back of your neck, etc. It's both frightening and also fascinating. So I don't want to downplay that, but what Esler has done is to treat religion, in spite of our condition of modernity, as a proper subject for sociology. And helpfully, she adopts a view of religion that focuses on it as a form of belief linked to the authority of tradition through memory. Her approach is to describe any form of believing as religious which sees its commitment to a chain of belief it adopts as all-absorbing. For her, in a religious community, the continuity of the lineage of the line of the believers, which she thinks is the source of religious belief, quote, is affirmed and manifested in the essentially religious act of recalling a past which gives meaning to the present and contains the future. The practice of anamnesis, that's the opposite of amnesia, anamnesis, of the recalling of memory to recalling to memory of the past is most often observed as a rite. Not always, sometimes we're just doing it non-ritually, but often it is. So this is the core for her. So for her, rites involve the recall of the foundational events that enabled the chain to form or affirm its power to persist through whatever vicissitudes have come and will still come to threaten it. So from a Jewish perspective, perhaps most fundamental, the giving of the law on Sinai. From a Christian perspective, the death and resurrection of Jesus. From a Muslim perspective, primal events in the prophet's life. So you can see how these things get recollected. Yet it's quite clear that in addition to the to the annual ritual events in religions and the regular services where Scripture is read, there's also exposure in educational settings and also in the individual reading of the Bible that's been a dominant feature of Protestant Christianity and much more important in Roman Catholicism since Vatican II. So, and lastly, one important feature of her approach is the recognition that a religious tradition is not static or calcified, but always incorporates an imaginative strain. The memory it evokes is always, in part at least, a reinvention affected through successive adjustments of memory. So I suppose here today we're thinking about how to imaginatively readjust our memory of biblical narrative and carry it forward into the future. So now I want to just move on to this issue of the weakening or collapse of Christian plausibility structures. It's clear, however, that much of the Christian plausibility structure has been significantly weakened since the 18th century. You probably all know the milestones, but let me run through a few of them. Clearly, the rise of science, leaving less and less role for God in nature, the arrival of the historical criticism of the Bible, a lot of it being written off as myth, and the assault on traditional morality and the rise of secularism since the Second World War. They've all been playing a big part in our current situation. For many sociologists, until a decade or so back, the very notion of modernity was equivalent to the steady advance of secularism and the retreat of religion. For many, Matthew Arnold's observations in Dover Beach were almost a social law. So this is from his famous poem. He says, "The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world." So that was sort of the view of the situation held by many sociologists, and indeed by a few, but mostly in the last decade or so, it's become apparent among sociologists that it was too soon to write religion's obituary. Religion has shown itself to be remarkably resilient, even if it is most vigorous in new forms. People seem to have a yearning for spirituality, often expressed in New Age modes, and even in the UK, some Pentecostal churches are booming. Of course, in many parts of the world, religion is just going from strength to strength. Europe is rather unusual. However, in spite of extremely low levels of church attendance in the UK, in the last census in 2011, 59% of us claim to be Christian. 59%. Now that's interesting. British sociologist at the University of Exeter, Grace Davey, has spoken of the pattern of believing without belonging in British and Northern European Christianity. Believing without belonging. So she points out that in Scandinavia, see, you find people who believe in God have no connection with their church. That's sort of paradigmatic. In Scandinavia, people happily pay their taxes, some of their taxes, to support churches that few of them ever attend, except for the liminal rites of baptism, marriage and death, or Christmas and Easter. So they actually pay to maintain this. So it's valued even though they don't go along. The fact that we say we are Christian, even if we are not regular church attenders, suggests that this is a strong identity claim for us. Religion in this sense provides what one author has called a sense of personal identity and continuity with the past, even after participation in ritual and even belief has lapsed. Nevertheless, in terms of the familiarity with the Bible, something I'm assuming most of us in this room hold dear, the current situation does give us some cause for apprehension. Now, it may well be that there is, and I know Kate has done some fine research on this, that there may well be scope for debate about the extent of biblical illiteracy in the community. Perhaps we shouldn't be too enthusiastic to rush to have a very negative view. I consider, though, that literacy of the Bible is very likely to vary with age. Older people in the UK had their formative years when Christian plausibility structures were still fairly robust and their means of propagating biblical narrative were largely operating with their full force and effect. But what happens to a younger generation that does not attend Sunday school or Sunday church services, does not live in homes that even possess a Bible, and is not exposed to much Bible, if any, at school? Back in 1998, I was co-teaching at the University of St Andrews with a now deceased friend of mine, an art historian, a module on the Bible and the visual arts. And we kicked off sort of the first session with the story of David and Bathsheba from 2 Samuel. We asked the 50 bright undergraduates, most of them from the UK or Britain, how many of them had heard of David and Bathsheba. 20 hands went up. Now, it's only one sample, and you may say 20 is quite a lot, but there were 30 who hadn't heard of the story, and we thought that was a bit surprising. I guess some familiarity with the Bible can be picked up incidentally from the songs of Bob Dylan and Bob Marley, for example, and curiosity may drive some of them to dip into a Bible. But I think basically we're looking at scattered biblical fragments worked into some wider cultural bricolage without any deep familiarity with or knowledge of biblical narrative. Does it matter? Does it matter? Who cares? Some people say that while we have enjoyed a strong shared biblical tradition, we will simply move into a future where we draw our ideas, values and imagery from other sources, and so be it. But clearly there will be consequences for culture, and I guess thinking about James's fine presentation, I guess I'm in the cultural Bible zone here today. One very significant casualty will be our understanding of European art. I once had the privilege of accompanying Professor David Brown of the University of St Andrews, a well-known Anglican theologian, and a group of his students around many of the religious paintings in the National Galleries of Scotland in Edinburgh. David has an incredible stock of biblical paintings in his memory, some thousands, I believe, and his knowledge of the iconography of the paintings was simply extraordinary. So too was his capacity to open up the meaning of the paintings. Granted, there's a lot more to a painting on a biblical scene than the narrative behind it. Nevertheless, the story and the way the artist has handled it are necessary aspects in appreciating and enjoying the work. The thought that in decades to come, people will wander past such canvases oblivious to the narratives they depict is a bleak one of, I suggest, profound cultural impoverishment. Writers who are unfamiliar with the Bible and or cannot rely on their authors to know it will also be deprived of access to an immense stock of stories that I'll return to toward the end of this presentation. Is there really, we might ask, with T.S. Eliot back in 1935, any future for the Bible as literature if its underpinning in widespread Christian faith disappears? So this is sort of the counterblast to Philip Pullman, etc. And what Eliot said in his essay back in 1935 is well worth mulling over, and I've got it on the sheet. I could fulminate against the men of letters who have gone into ecstasies over the Bible as literature, the Bible as the noblest monument of English prose. Those who talk of the Bible as a monument of English prose are merely admiring it as a monument over the grave of Christianity. Just as the work of Clarendon or Gibbon or Buffon or Bradley would be of inferior literary value if it were insignificant as history, science and philosophy respectively, so the Bible has had a literary influence upon English literature, not because it's been considered as literature, but because it has been considered as the report of the Word of God. And the fact that men of letters now discuss it as literature probably indicates the end of its literary influence. W.H. Auden said all that rather more succinctly in that nice little couplet, "Thou shalt not be a friend to those who read the Bible for its prose." But looking back now, I think that, although I hadn't read Eliot's essay when I was responding to Fry back in Canberra in 1984, I guess that was my instinctive feeling. I think actually it may not be right. It may be too bleak a view. Certainly back in the 1960s, when the French structuralist critic Roland Barthes began doing structuralist work on the Bible, this is from a non-faith perspective, he started an immense industry among literary critics, which is only now beginning to abate. So I guess it is possible for things to happen in relation to an interest in the Bible without the underlying faith. So who knows what the future holds. Basically, though, unlike Auden, I submit we should be friends with those who read the Bible for any purpose. So moving now to this issue of what type of people read the Bible, I think it's helpful if we're thinking of what we can do about promoting biblical reading to think about who might do it and for what reason and what they'll get out of it. So what I've done on the handout is the back is a little model. I generated this model in a book on biblical narrative in 2011, which is referred to in the thing. So basically what we've got here, we've got two axes. So I dreamt this up, take it for what it's worth, but I find it helpful. The vertical axis is readers for religious reasons at the top and readers for non-religious reasons at the bottom, and the horizontal axis on the right, non-professional readers, and on the left, professional readers. So when you generate 4 quadrants, remember this is really an aid to thinking, it's not really a pigeonholing exercise, but anyway, in quadrant A we have typically practicing Christian and Jewish lay people. Now, that's the biggest group by far. So these people hear passages from the Bible read at church or synagogue, encounter it in educational settings, or they read it privately. There are hundreds of millions of them, maybe a billion. If we recall what I said earlier about religion as a chain of memory, we can see that there is a powerful connection still between the biblical narratives and the life and identity of these people in their faith communities. Still going on. And then in quadrant B, we have non-professional readers for non-religious reasons. So these, I guess, are one-time practicing Jews and Christians on the one hand, and curious people and searchers on the other. That's the next largest group, I guess, with millions of people involved. Then in quadrant C, professional readers for religious reasons. So I'm one of those, okay? These are hundreds of thousands of people like priests, ministers and rabbis, believing Jewish and Christian biblical critics, believing undergraduates and postgraduates undertaking biblical studies, and believing artists, writers and composers interested in the Bible. And then lastly, and I think we have to really stress this group, a very important group, professional readers for non-religious reasons. So probably the smallest, but some of them are very influential. It includes agnostic or atheist biblical critics, comparative literature critics, art historians and musicologists, artists, filmmakers, composers and journalists. So once we set out those four possible types of reader, and granted there may be many other ways to do this, we can then think about the reasons they might have for wanting to read the Bible and to acquire biblical literacy. My first reason takes us back to the French sociologist's point, the reality of religion as a chain of memory. That will continue to provide a reason for all those people in quadrant A to keep returning to the text. But also maybe some of the people in quadrant B, one-time Christians and Jews returning to these narratives out of nostalgia for their past and their contribution to their sense of who they are, will also undergo a form of cultural anamnesis, of remembering or perhaps re-remembering. People in this group who read the narratives for reasons of faith will nevertheless carry with them a stock of stories that can be transformed into other stories like C.S. Lewis, or works of art such as the wonderful Oxford artist Roger Wagner, who paints such provocative contemporary versions of biblical stories. So that's the first one. Now, another. This is my second reason for reading and rereading biblical texts. This is because they provide or disclose more ample possibilities for being human. More ample possibilities for being human. This line has been well developed by Oxford Old Testament scholar John Barton, using lines of thought from the US academic Martha Nussbaum. So Nussbaum is mainly interested in Greek tragedy and modern fiction, for example Dickens and Henry James, and she argues that from these works we can obtain insight into life. And the process depends, she says, on the closeness of any reality we can grasp to fiction. So she's sort of blurring the division between real experience and fiction to say that we can enrich our lives through exposure to fictional characterisation. She says, stories can disclose for us the possibilities of being human. And then Barton develops that in relation to biblical narratives and to the characters in those narratives by saying, we learn from these stories how to live. We learn how to live because we discover from them how voluntary decisions interact with unpredictable consequences to generate moral character. So we discover from them how voluntary decisions interact with unpredictable consequences to generate moral character. Think about David. Okay, his desire to summon Bathsheba, and it was a summoning, not an invitation, an escorted summoning of Bathsheba back to his palace, led to a whole cycle, initially of horror and eventually of something a little bit better. But you can see the way that the experience is stamped on his character. And it's hard to read David's story and not find it does actually tell us stuff about who we are or could be, or who we are and shouldn't be. And I think that particular aspect is likely to appeal to people in all four quadrants. My third reason for reading the Bible is that it can promote intercultural understanding. Now, here I actually have in mind the extent to when we read the Bible, the biblical narratives, for their historical meaning, what they meant to their original audiences, in relation to their ancient context, we're actually struck with how remote they are from us. Now, some people think that's bad. I think that's very, very good. Because the fact that the Bible narratives seem to be very distant from us actually means they can speak to us in new and unsuspected ways, and that by attending to such meanings, our capacity for intercultural understanding and sensitivity is enhanced. So I see this process as very similar to what happens when you go to live in another culture with a sensitivity to its nature. So you're not sort of, like the ugly American of the film. You go and live somewhere, you embed yourself in the culture, you're sensitive to its ways of thinking and doing, and you come to see things from those people's point of view. When you come home, you then find yourself as a kind of intercultural person, because you know what your own culture says and thinks about situations. You also know what that culture says and thinks. You have that kind of foot in both world experience, which can be very valuable in terms of human understanding. So I think reading the Bible for original meaning does have that effect. So while people in all four quadrants might find that a good reason for reading the Bible, the religious readers in quadrants A and C, the ones on the right-hand side, are likely to regard this as even more compelling, because the authors to whose meanings they are attending are their ancestors in faith. Now, I don't know about you, maybe it's my creeping senility and age, but thinking about one's ancestors, but I find the notion of one's ancestors is quite a powerful one in telling us who we are. So these, if you're still on the religious sort of side of this picture, when you read Paul, or when you read the unknown author of 1 Samuel on David, or on Saul, in a way you're attending to someone from your sacred formative past, from the primal time in which the identity of the group that you value and belong to was in its original form, hammered out. I find that powerful, maybe you do too. And then lastly, fourthly and not leastly, we have to consider the reason that it's well worthwhile attending to biblical stories just because they're stories. As David Gunn and Donna Fuel say at the start of their book, Narrative in the Hebrew Bible, stories are a staple of human life, and stories abound in the Hebrew Bible. They also abound in the New Testament, in the parables, for example. Stories are a staple of human life. Now, stories are a staple of human lives, whether, as John Barton suggests, they shape human lives or not. So I want to make that distinction. Yes, I agree with Barton that stories can shape lives, but actually they're also rather good just as stories. And this I think is because of our love of mimesis, the human love of imitation, of our being able, when we read a mimetic experience in a story, of our being able, by hearing or reading the story, to enter a created, imaginative realm that draws on our everyday experience but transmutes it into a reality having its own independent existence in reliance on aesthetic, not physical laws. So, we enter the world of the novel. It's related to everyday reality, but we know it's different. We enjoy that notion of being in a represented or a fictive world. We don't know why, but actually it's kind of an aesthetic experience. It's a bit like the experience of play. So we need to take play seriously. I don't want to sound too silly, but we do. Play is not necessarily an escape from reality. Rather, as one eminent critic has expressed it, when we read a novel or a play or a poem, he says, all those purposive relations which determine active and caring existence haven't simply disappeared. So all those purposive relations which determine active and caring existence have not simply disappeared, but in a curious way acquire a different quality. So there's something about story. So while people from all four quadrants may read the Bible for this reason, for non-religious readers, I think it's going to be the dominant motivation. And that's presumably why Philip Pullman is attracted to the Bible. He's a magnificent storyteller, and he sees in the Bible magnificent stories. So let me just, in this last section, move on to saying something a little bit more about the stories, or penultimate section. I was very taken about 10 years ago when I read Christopher Booker's book, The 7 Basic Plots, Why We Tell Stories. Booker is a well-known journalist, one of the founders of Private Eye, spent 30 years or so reading a huge number of novels and watching a very large number of movies to generate a typology of the world's great plots, the great storylines. Now, he also generated a Jungian explanation for why they were popular. I suggest we bracket that aspect of his work, which I must say I don't find convincing, but simply concentrate on what I think is a brilliant, if you like, phenomenology, a kind of deep description and organisation of 7 basic plots. So let me just run through them because they all appear in the Bible. So, number 1, overcoming the monster. So here the protagonist sets out to defeat an antagonistic force which threatens the protagonist and or his or her homeland. So think about Beowulf, or The War of the World, or Star Wars, or James Bond, Dr. No, or actually any James Bond novel. Number 2, rags to riches. The poor protagonist begins with things such as power, wealth and a mate, or at least a reasonable position in life, before losing it all and then gaining it back again and growing as a person in consequence. So examples, Cinderella, The Ugly Duckling, Aladdin. Thirdly, the quest. The protagonist and some compatriots set out to acquire an important object or to get to a location facing many obstacles and temptations along the way. Examples, the Iliad, King Solomon's Mines, the Lord of the Rings, the Pilgrim's Progress. Fourthly, voyage and return. The protagonist goes to a strange land and after overcoming the threats it poses to him or her, returns with nothing but experience. Examples include the Odyssey. Well, that's the main one. The Odyssey, I'll come to some biblical ones in a second. Fifthly, comedy. The protagonists are destined to be in love, but something is keeping them from being together, which is resolved at the end of the story, typically when they all get married. Examples, virtually any Shakespearean comedy you can name, Bridget Jones' Diary, sort of, and 4 Weddings and a Funeral, well, 3 out of 4. Sixth, tragedy. So here the protagonist is a villain who falls from grace and whose death is actually a happy ending, sort of. Examples include Macbeth, The Picture of Dorian Gray, Bonnie and Clyde, etc., etc., etc. And then seventh and last, rebirth. So the protagonist is a villain or otherwise unlikable person who redeems him or herself during the course of the story. Examples include The Frog Prince, Beauty and the Beast, and of course A Christmas Carol. Now, what I want to do is just to give you some idea of how rich the Bible is in presenting narratives that use one or more of these storylines. So, for an example of rags to riches, consider the story of Judah and Tamar in Genesis 38. So Tamar at first establishes herself in Judah's family by an honourable marriage to his eldest son, When he dies, she's then married to his brother, but then he dies. This, of course, is the notorious Onan who displeased the Lord by practising coitus interruptus. Judah then sends her back as a widow to her father's house, promising that she will marry his third son when he's old enough, but really having no such intention. I think they're a bit worried about the way this lady is leading to the deaths of their sons in succession. Anyway, as you recollect, she then tricks Judah into having sex with her, but then reaches the lowest point when her father-in-law, all of a sudden again, discovering she was pregnant, calls for her to be pulled out from a house and burnt. He then discovers, through the artful trick she's played on him, that he himself is the father. So she then produces 2 sons, one of whom becomes an ancestor of David. So you can see the sort of very clear rags to riches pattern. You can see a similar story in that of Hannah in 1 Samuel 1 and 2. Remember, Hannah is one of two co-wives married to a man called Elkanah. So Hannah is barren while Peninnah, her co-wife, has children, something that Peninnah mocks her about publicly every year when they go to Shiloh for the festival. So Hannah then prays to Yahweh to have a child, have a son. She does so. He's Samuel, whom she later dedicates to God in the temple, and she's then able to exult over her enemies, who in good Mediterranean fashion must include her co-wife. So that's another rags to riches story. Now, in terms of slaying the monster, David and Goliath in 1 Samuel 17. But similarly, the story of Judith. Do you know the story of Judith? Okay, it's in the Apocrypha, so it's written perhaps in the 1st century BC. So Israel is invaded by a vast Babylonian host led by a man called Holofernes. Judith's town is besieged, they're running out of food and water, they're about to capitulate. She says, no, all sorts of things out. She's a beautiful widow, by the way. So she goes down to the enemy camp, beguiles Holofernes, and without any stain on her own honour, gets him dead drunk one night and then cuts off his head with his own sword. Carries it back to her town, Bethulia. Hey presto, the Israelites defeat the Babylonians the next day. So, if you like, those two stories are very, very similar. The big similarity, for example, being the fact that each of them, David and Judith, kill the leader of the enemy host by cutting off his head with his own sword. That's why you sometimes see them on two sides of church doors in Italian churches. And then for voyage and return, think about the story of the parable son. But perhaps a bit more unusually, I just want to go back to David. So David's dalliance with Bathsheba means that he journeys not to another place or time or social milieu, but inwardly to a new immoral state. So it's a voyage to a new state of immorality, of adultery, of disloyalty, and then of murder. A journey, if you like, away from his true self, a journey that denies his own good heart that God had previously recognised in him. But nevertheless, eventually he does return to some semblance of his own self, and you can see him later on at various incidents in this narrative behaving in a way that is very far away from, at least as the narrative presents it, from engaging in any more bloodshed. You could look at many more biblical narratives. The point I want to make here is that the Bible contains some of the earliest and finest examples extant of the types of seven storyline that Booker has so cleverly identified. They've been hugely influential in the past, and they have the power to continue to be, but only if the Bible is read. Only if biblical literacy in that sense is preserved in our culture. What should we do lastly? Well, as I said earlier at the start of this, I think probably that's something we should talk about in groups and perhaps have James reflect on later on if it comes up at the end of the day. I just want to tell you one little initiative that we're plotting at the University of Gloucestershire. My colleague Angus Pryor, who is there the head of the School of Art and Design and a very fine artist of biblical themes, and I are planning a competition for students doing both fine art and religious studies in AS and A levels. So the idea will be they have to paint a painting on a biblical theme, which we'll have a competition about and have a generous prize for, and probably exhibit the winners of at the Wilson Gallery in Cheltenham. But that's just some way that we hope visually, because we will be sending out the information to 1,000 schools in England and Wales, to promote the idea that we need, especially with the plausibility structure declining, we need to think perhaps creatively about new ways to ensure that there are bright, especially younger minds, getting a sense of how interesting and important these narratives are. That's my presentation, but I'm here to be questioned, abused, ridiculed, you name it.